Hello, my name is Nicole Jescinth Smith, but everyone calls me Nikki. I'm a 2006 graduate of the MFA program in theatrical costume design. My last theatrical costume design was the 2013 production at a Clarence Brown Theater of A Raisin in the Sun. Currently, you can see my work on the small screen, including The Americans, on which I was the assistant costume designer for 3 seasons, Pose on FX, which I was the costume designer for the 2nd season, America's Got Talent, and The Tonight Show. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Lenape people, past and present, who have stewarded this land through many generations. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the Black and brown hands that have worked the land without acknowledgement and payment. This week, we explore Lorraine Hansberry and A Raisin in the Sun. While Lorraine Hansberry was the first Black female playwright to be produced on Broadway, it's important to know that Black theater in America was already flourishing with the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and the Chitlin Circuit of the 1930s. The popularity of Black theater led to the establishment of the Federal Theater Project in 1935. The same year that Langston Hughes' Mulatto became a Broadway hit. Although we mainly think of the Black male icons of literature at this time, it was a female poet and playwright, Angela W. Grimke, who was one of the most important voices that helped kick off the Harlem Renaissance with her poetry and play Rachel, produced in 1916. Lorraine Hansberry was born in 1930 in Chicago to middle-class parents who were very politically active. When Hansberry was 8 years old, their family moved into the all-white subdivision of Washington Park. The South Side Chicago housing desegregation fight, of which her father, Carl Hansberry, was a part of, became the inspiration behind her play A Raisin in the Sun, which would receive its Broadway premiere in 1959 to wide critical acclaim. As James Baldwin once quoted, "Never before in the entire history of the American theater had so much of the truth of Black people's lives been seen on the stage." Where Brecht used social distancing and alienation to drive home a political point, A Raisin in the Sun uses realism to root the characters in the contemporary society of the time that it was written. This is why, as a designer, it is important to emulate the fashions and silhouettes accurately, especially when dealing with a very particular socioeconomic status. It is important with a show like this to make sure that your design is based in realism. The period of the civil rights movement is very iconic, but to add modern touches into it kind of takes away from the importance of that moment. When you look at the silhouettes of a very particular minority in a certain socioeconomic status, it is important that you make sure even the fabrics reflect that. The overall silhouette of the 1960s does have a sense of modernity to it, and we do recognize it, but at the same time, you have to keep it authentic to what the 1960s were so that there's that special disconnect from modern life and you can actually see the characters in a world that is uniquely and particularly their own. The design for Beneatha and Ruth are both what I would say 2 sides of the young woman who is present in the civil rights movement at this time. Ruth, on one hand, embodies the virtuous homemaker woman with silhouettes that are very evocative of a late 50s classical silhouette, especially in her mustard dress and the green dress, very, very much so are rooted in that classic Dior silhouette from the 40s that kind of translated into the 50s and kind of became that iconic what you aspire to be as a woman. On the other hand, we have Beneatha, who's a young, talented, smart woman who's wearing pants, who's wearing sleeveless numbers, who's really like living in her own body. And I wanted to make sure that her clothing spoke of a woman who's moving forward, who has direction, and who is learning about herself. Not to say that Ruth doesn't have direction, but they're moving at distinctly different paces. One of my favorite moments in the overall design of A Raisin in the Sun is the beautiful moment where she puts on the traditional Nigerian dress. It is so important to make sure whenever you have that moment in a script, in a play, that really pinpoints to another culture, that it's done accurately and authentically. There is an extra level of research that goes into it that the audience may never see, and really no one may ever know but yourself, but it holds you to a level of authenticity and realism when you're dealing with another culture. I also wanted to make sure that when we were tying different pieces, even specifically the gili, that it was done correctly and that our crew could do it after I'd left the show. There's nothing more disheartening as someone who is a minority to see my culture whitewashed or misrepresented by a designer. It is very important that when we are dealing with marginalized groups, that the designers are representative of that particular group or the culture. There's something that is authentic, that comes from the culture, that cannot be emulated, that cannot be researched, that is that extra added creative voice that comes from being a part of a marginalized culture and getting the opportunity to authentically represent it. While Lorraine Hansberry was definitely not the first Black artist to create theater in America, the cultural impact that the opening of A Raisin in the Sun had was an undeniable turning point. It is a great example of why representation matters, not only for the actors on the stage, but also the voices writing the words and bringing the production to life. Hansberry undoubtedly paved the way for two of our most successful contemporary playwrights. Two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Lynn Nottage, whose plays include Intimate Apparel, Ruined, and Sweat, and Dominique Morisseau, who wrote Detroit 67 and Pipeline. I would be remiss to not bring up the current climate of Black Lives Matter. It's so important that this social movement has taken center stage in our lives and should also be echoed in our theater that we see. Representation of young Black voices is so vital to the overall thread and just the overall structure of our theatrical culture. It is important that these voices are heard clearly and articulated by the people who have lived them. Representation matters. It is important that young BIPOC people are allowed to express themselves so that people who may have never heard of their stories, who may never share in their walks of life, can now become a part of a world that is so uniquely not their own, but still is a part of our world and our culture. It is important to also speak about organizations that have been present since writers like Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin were putting pen to paper. For example, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has been around for as long as I can remember. It is important to acknowledge that this organization has stood by young Black people, has elevated Black voices, has sought to seek social change on behalf of marginalized Black and Brown people. Not only did Lorraine Hansberry have to exist as a Black female artist inside of white America, she also had to deal with the fact that she was a queer woman inside of Black America. It is a fact that is often overlooked and sometimes completely disregarded. It is very important whenever we're talking about or exalting or even examining the lives of artists that we examine all aspects of their lives. Come back next week as we discuss how theater has been used as an outlet for the LGBTQ community, to fight for understanding, to spread awareness, and to overcome adversity. Thank you for listening.